Ethan Holloway had never believed in ghosts. He was a rational man, someone who dismissed horror movies as cheap tricks and scoffed at the so-called true ghost stories people love to share. But that was before he spent the night at Blackwood Inn, and before he stayed in room 6. It started as a routine business trip. His company had booked him into a small, old-fashioned inn just outside of Salem, Massachusetts. Blackwood Inn had once been a grand estate, built in the early 1800s, but had since been converted into a hotel. The place had charm, he admitted, with its dark wooden beams and antique furnishings, but there was something off. The air felt heavy, as if the walls held secrets they were reluctant to share. When Ethan checked in, the receptionist, an elderly woman with silver hair pulled into a tight bun, hesitated before handing him his key. "Room 6, she muttered, almost to herself. "Everything all right?" Ethan asked, raising an eyebrow. She hesitated, her fingers tightening around the key for just a second too long before sliding it across the counter. "That room. Some guests have found it unsettling," she admitted. "Unsettling how?" A shadow passed over her face. "Strange noises at night. Voices when there's no one there. But I'm sure it's just old pipes or the wind." Ethan smirked. "I think I'll survive." That night, he regretted his arrogance. Room 6 was ordinary. A little outdated maybe, but nothing that screamed haunted. A 4-poster bed stood against the far wall, an old armchair in the corner, a wooden dresser with a dusty mirror above it. The only unusual thing was the locked door to an adjoining room, one that wasn't in use. Ethan went about his night as usual, brushed his teeth, checked his emails, set his alarm for the morning. He climbed into bed and turned off the light. At exactly 3:12 a.m., he woke up. A whisper. At first, he thought it was part of his dream. A faint, distant murmuring, like someone speaking from another room. But as his mind sharpened from sleep, he realized the sound was inside his room. His pulse quickened. "Hello?" he called out. The whispering stopped. He sat up, straining his ears in the silence. Maybe it was just the wind. Maybe the old pipes really did make strange noises. Convinced he was imagining things, he laid back down. Then, scraping. A slow, deliberate sound, like nails dragging along the wooden floor. This time, his body went rigid. He reached for his phone and turned on the flashlight, sweeping the beam across the room. Nothing. But then, the doorknob to the locked adjoining room turned. A slow, rattling motion, as if someone on the other side was trying to open it. Ethan's stomach dropped. For the first time in years, he felt something he never thought he would. Pure, unfiltered fear. By morning, Ethan was exhausted. He barely slept after the incident, keeping one eye on the locked door the entire night. He tried to shake it off as his imagination, but deep down, he knew something was wrong with room 6. That evening, he returned to the inn determined to prove to himself that he wasn't afraid. He even laughed about it with the receptionist. "That room gave me the creeps last night," he admitted. "I swear I heard someone whispering." She gave him a strange look. "What did it say?" Ethan paused. Now that he thought about it, he hadn't understood the whispers. They were just sounds, unintelligible and distant. "I don't know," he admitted. The receptionist hesitated. "If you're uncomfortable, I can move you to another room." Ethan forced a smile. "No need. I'm sure I just imagined it." That night, at 3:12 a.m., he woke up again. Only this time, he wasn't alone. The whispering returned, louder now, filling every inch of the room. It was urgent, insistent, like someone was trying to warn him of something. The air was freezing. And then, he saw it. The mirror above the dresser. There was a woman standing in it. Pale, with dark, hollow eyes, and a mouth twisted open in a silent scream. Her dress was torn, soaked in something dark. But the worst part? She was behind him. Ethan spun around. Nothing. His breath came in short gasps as he turned back to the mirror. The woman was closer now. Her reflection shouldn't have been there. There was no one else in the room. But in the mirror she moved. One bony hand lifted, pressing against the glass from the inside. Her lips parted, and this time, he could understand her whisper. "Get out." The lights flickered. The locked door rattled violently. The whispering rose to an unbearable level, voices upon voices screaming in agony. Ethan didn't think. He grabbed his bag, ripped open the door, and ran. He left Blackwood Inn that night, refusing to return. The next morning, he checked out without a word. But curiosity wouldn't let him rest. He spent the next few weeks researching the inn, trying to find anything about Room 6. And then he found it. A newspaper article from 1871. A woman named Eleanor Finch had been murdered in Room 6, strangled in her sleep by her husband. Her body was never found, because he hid it inside the walls. For years, guests had reported whispers, cold spots, nightmares of a woman screaming. Some had even seen her in the mirror, just like Ethan had. But what terrified him the most? The last recorded guest to see her died 3 days later. A heart attack, in his sleep, with bruises on his throat. The night after Ethan read the article, he woke up at 3:12 a.m., and from the mirror across his room, the whispering had returned. Jacob Hale was an ordinary guy. He didn't believe in ghosts, demons, or any of those so-called scary stories. To him, it was all just make-believe, tales meant to frighten children. But that changed on the night when someone knocked on his door. It was a cold autumn evening. Rain tapped against the windows, and the wind howled outside. But Jacob felt comfortable. He was wrapped in a warm blanket, watching a show while lazily scrolling through his phone. His wife, Laura, had left on a business trip, so he was alone in their countryside house. It was just an ordinary night, until he heard a knock at the door. Knock, knock, knock. Jacob frowned. Who would come at this hour? The clock read 11:47 p.m. He got up, walked to the door, and peered through the peephole. No one was there. His breath hitched. Maybe it was the wind. Maybe he imagined it. But then the knocking came again. Knock, knock, knock. Louder this time. More insistent. A chill ran down Jacob's spine. He looked through the peephole again. Still no one there. And then, he heard a voice. A low, quiet, female voice. "Open the door. Please." His throat went dry. "Who is it?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Help me." The voice was wrong, warped, distorted, inhuman. Something inside Jacob screamed, "Don't open it." He took a step back, but then something truly terrifying happened. The doorknob slowly turned. Someone on the other side was trying to come in. Jacob stumbled backward, his pulse hammering in his ears. He grabbed his phone and dialed 911, but no signal. Damn country house. Then, without warning, the power went out. And that's when he heard the breathing. Not his own. Someone else's. Deep, uneven breathing. Right outside the door. Jacob stood frozen, barely daring to breathe himself. And then, it knocked again. Knock, knock, knock. But now the sound came from the living room window. Jacob spun around, and he saw her. A pale figure stood outside the window. She wasn't moving, not blinking, not breathing. Her face was blurred, as if hidden by shadows, but Jacob knew she was staring right at him, smiling. "You let me in." Jacob bolted for the back door. He wasn't thinking, just moving. In the darkness, he fumbled his way down to the basement, slammed the door shut behind him, and locked it with the heavy latch. The basement was silent, but it wasn't over, because upstairs, behind the locked door, he heard a voice, a woman's voice, right outside. "You let me in." Jacob clenched his fists, trying to steady his breathing. You can't come in," he whispered. But the voice laughed, a cold, emotionless laugh that sent ice down his spine. "You already opened the door, Jacob." He hadn't opened the door, but then, he remembered. When he looked through the peephole, when he heard the voice, he had unlatched the deadbolt. He had touched the doorknob. He had turned it. just a fraction, and that was enough. The basement light flickered, and then he heard the last sound of his life, a whisper right next to his ear. "Thank you." And the world went black. Ethan Carter had never been afraid of mirrors. To him, they were just glass and silver, nothing more. But that was before he moved into the old apartment on Ridgewood Lane. Before he started seeing things that shouldn't be there. Before his reflection stopped being his own. Ethan had just moved in. The place was cheap. Too cheap for how nice it looked. A little dusty, a little old-fashioned, but otherwise fine. The bathroom mirror, however, was strange. It was massive, taking up nearly the entire wall. The glass was flawless, no smudges, no cracks. But when Ethan stood in front of it that first night, something felt off. At first he couldn't tell what it was. His reflection looked normal. But when he turned away, just for a second, he could have sworn. His reflection didn't move. A chill crawled up his spine. He snapped his head back toward the mirror. His reflection was normal again, moving like it should. "Just tired," Ethan muttered, shaking it off. But as he turned away to leave the bathroom, he swore he saw something in the mirror's depths, a second pair of eyes watching him. Days passed. Ethan tried to ignore the mirror, but every night, when he brushed his teeth or washed his face, that unsettling feeling returned, like he wasn't alone. Then, one night, it happened. Ethan finished washing up, wiped his face with a towel, and looked up at the mirror. His reflection was already smiling. He wasn't smiling. His stomach twisted into knots. He stood there, frozen, staring at his own face. Slowly, very slowly, his reflection's smile faded, until it matched his own expression again. Ethan's heart pounded. He forced himself to take a step back. The moment he moved, his reflection followed perfectly, like nothing had happened. Maybe he had imagined it. Maybe the dim lighting had played a trick on him. But then he noticed something else. The reflection of the bathroom door behind him. It was slightly open. In reality, it was shut. And in that small sliver of open space in the mirror's version of the door, something was standing there, watching. Ethan barely slept that night. He covered the mirror with an old bedsheet, but that didn't help. He could still feel something on the other side, waiting. The next morning, he made a decision. He was getting rid of the mirror. Ethan grabbed the largest hammer he had, took a deep breath, and yanked the sheet away. But the mirror wasn't reflecting his bedroom anymore. It was showing something else. The room in the mirror was wrong. The walls were darker, the furniture decayed, and standing there, staring back at him, was himself. But it wasn't him. The Ethan in the mirror had sunken eyes, his skin sickly pale. His lips were cracked, and his fingernails were blackened, like he had been crawling through dirt. And worst of all, he was grinning. Not just a normal grin, a wide, unnatural, grotesque smile. Ethan staggered back, gripping the hammer so tightly his knuckles turned white. His reflection lifted its own hammer, and then it moved first. The glass didn't shatter like it should have. Instead, it rippled, like water. The hammer from the other side pushed through, followed by a hand, Ethan's hand, but rotting, wrong, broken. Ethan screamed and swung his hammer hard, smashing into the glass. But instead of breaking, the mirror's surface sucked him in like a whirlpool. The last thing he saw was his apartment, the real world, vanishing behind a curtain of darkness. Then he was falling. Ethan woke up on the other side. The room was dead. Dust floated through the air, and the walls were cracked and peeling. The air was thick, suffocating. And the mirror, it was still there. Only now, it didn't show the same dark, decayed world. It showed his apartment, his real apartment. And standing inside, staring back at him, was himself. The other Ethan. He was still grinning. And behind him, in Ethan's real world, the bathroom door was opening. Something was stepping inside, and Ethan, the real Ethan, was stuck. Screaming, pounding, begging to get out. But no one could hear him. because now he was just a reflection.